Inequality is a side effect of globalization. Just the people at the top ends who were benefiting, and many people, perhaps most people, were being left behind. And capitalism can create inequality, but it's also the main source of our prosperity. The answer, I think, is not to eliminate capitalism, but rather to attack problems like inequality directly. But I wouldn't say it's dramatic improvement because inequality is still high, very high, but Thailand is one of the few countries in the region which has been moving in the right direction.
สวัสดีค่ะปัญหาความเหลื่อมล้ำเป็นปัญหาใหญ่ในหลายประเทศทั่วโลกรวมถึงประเทศไทยด้วยศาสตราจารย์ดรเอริกมาสกินเจ้าของรางวัลโนเบลสาขาเศรษฐศาสตร์ปี 2007 เดินทางมาที่ประเทศไทยตามคำเชิญของ International Peace Foundation อาจารย์มาสกินได้ไปพูดคุยกับคนหลากหลายกลุ่มในประเทศไทยนะคะดิฉันเองก็มีโอกาสสัมภาษณ์อาจารย์ก็เลยถามอาจารย์ละค่ะว่าต้นตอของความเหลื่อมล้ำมาจากไหนกันแน่ใช่เพราะทุนนิยมหรือเปล่าและอาจารย์จะให้คะแนนประเทศไทยสักกี่คะแนนสำหรับการแก้ไขปัญหาความเหลื่อมล้ำและเราทุกคนควรจะรับมือกับ AI อย่างไรดีค่ะเอริกมาสกินนักเศรษฐศาสตร์ชาวอเมริกันผู้คว้ารางวัลโนเบลสาขาเศรษฐศาสตร์ในปี 2007 ปัจจุบันมาสกินเป็นอาจารย์สอนวิชาเศรษฐศาสตร์และคณิตศาสตร์ประจำมหาวิทยาลัยฮาร์วาร์ดเขาแสดงความคิดเห็นที่น่าสนใจเกี่ยวกับโลกาภิวัตน์หรือ globalization ที่ไม่ได้นำมาแค่ความเจริญแต่ยังนำมาซึ่งสถานการณ์ความเหลื่อมล้ำในสังคมโลกที่ถูกถ่างให้กว้างมากขึ้นเรื่อยๆ Thank you so much, Professor Maskin, for your time today. Let's talk about globalization and inequality. Can you first of all tell us what is the current situation right now globally in terms of inequality?
Let me first say that globalization has been a very positive, a very powerful force toward raising many countries' level of prosperity around the world. So I am very much a pro-globalization economist. I think that without globalization, the world would be a much poorer place. Thailand has benefited from globalization. China was a poor country 40 years ago, and now it has the second biggest economy in the world, and this is almost entirely due to globalization. So globalization, on average, has been very much a force good. But the problem with globalization is that its benefits are very unequally distributed within countries. At a global level, inequality has actually improved in the sense that poor countries have risen relative to rich countries. But within countries, things have become more unequal. And that's because globalization gives good and new job opportunities to people with skills. Even such a simple skill as being able to speak English is valuable in a globalized world. It will enable you to get jobs that you couldn't get without English. So people with reasonably good skills get fantastic job opportunities and see their incomes rise. But people without skills, people who are working in, say, traditional agriculture, don't get these opportunities, and they don't get improvements in their income. They are left behind. Globalization leaves them behind. And so the skilled people see their incomes improve. The unskilled people see their incomes stay the same or perhaps even fall, and that's what creates inequality. And that inequality is a side effect of globalization.
Does capitalism play a part as well in this whole picture?
Sure. These jobs are created by capitalists. That's where most job creation comes from. So if we were all living under socialism or communism, our wages, our incomes might be equal, But the problem with a socialist system or a communist system is that entrepreneurs, the people who are the driving force behind improvements in an economy, no longer have the incentive to make those improvements because entrepreneurs want to see return on their efforts. And under a socialist system, they don't get that return. So yes, capitalism can create inequality, but it's also the main source of our prosperity. The answer, I think, is not to eliminate capitalism, but rather to attack problems like inequality directly. You don't need to change the underlying capitalist system. What you do need to do is to focus directly on the inequality problem.
มัสกินเป็นนักเศรษฐศาสตร์ที่สนใจมาตลอดนะคะว่าทำไมความเหลื่อมล้ำจึงเกิดขึ้นในเศรษฐกิจของประเทศเกิดใหม่ก่อนที่เขาจะพบว่าความเหลื่อมล้ำคือผลข้างเคียงมาจากโลกาภิวัตน์แต่ในเมื่อโลกาภิวัตน์ไม่ใช่ภัยคุกคามและทุนนิยมก็ไม่ใช่สิ่งเลวร้ายเสมอไปแนวทางการแก้ปัญหาความเหลื่อมล้ำที่มัสกินเสนอจึงเป็นการแก้ปัญหาที่ทักษะแรงงาน
Okay, so how do we tackle the inequality problems? And is it the job of the government only, or the private sector, or the individual as well?
So the most straightforward solution to dealing with inequality is to give the people who have been left behind, the unskilled workers, the skills they need so that their labor is in demand by the global economy.
So that's the role of the government.
To some extent. The problem with skill training, it doesn't come for free. You have to pay for it. And the question is, who is going to pay for it? Now, the unskilled workers are too poor to pay for it. They can't pay for their own education. They don't have the money to do that. So you can't expect them to be making this kind of investment. Now, you might hope that the private sector would do it, that the employers would do it. If you're a company and I'm an unskilled worker, you could train me to do a job in your company, and then I would be able to do it. But the problem is that after you've made that investment in me, after you have raised my skill level,
You quit.
I quit and I go to work for your competitor, and you've lost your investment. So that tells us that we can't expect the private sector alone to solve the problem. What could be an answer is for the government to get involved, not necessarily by doing the training itself, but by giving you, the private company, the incentive to train me. And the way that the government can do that is, for example, to give you a tax break if you train me. Then you might be willing to train me because, even if I quit, you still get your tax break. Or they could give you a subsidy according to how many unskilled workers you train. But my point is that without the government's involvement in the skill training process, the problem is not likely to be solved because the workers can't do it and the employers don't have the incentive to do it.
รายงานของ World Bank ระบุว่าในช่วง 20 ปีที่ผ่านมาไทยมีความคืบหน้าในการลดระดับความเหลื่อมล้ำอย่างมากแต่ถึงเช่นนั้นความเหลื่อมล้ำก็ยังอยู่ในระดับสูงในปี 2021 ค่าสัมประสิทธิ์จีนี่ของไทย Gini Coefficient ซึ่งเป็นดัชนีชี้วัดความเหลื่อมล้ำอยู่ที่43.3 สูงที่สุดในเอเชียตะวันออกและแปซิฟิกและอยู่อันดับที่ 13 จาก 63 ประเทศเนื่องจากประชากรที่รวยที่สุดเพียง 10% ถือครองความมั่งคั่งเกินกว่าครึ่งหนึ่งของความมั่งคั่งทั้งประเทศ
Now for Thailand, we have this problem of inequality.
Right.
We are one of the most unequal countries in Southeast Asia.
That's true, but inequality has actually been falling in Thailand in recent years. You're right that it's very high, but it's no longer as high as it was when I first started coming to Thailand in 2010. So there's been
improvements?
There's been significant improvement. I wouldn't say it's dramatic improvement because inequality is still high, very high, but Thailand is one of the few countries in the region which has been moving in the right direction.
What else can Thailand do to speed up, to close the gap, this inequality gap?
I think investment by government through subsidizing companies, or in some cases by enabling workers to go to schools where they can learn skills. There's no substitute for that kind of investment. That is the key to solving the problem. And
Which countries, Professor, do you think are good examples of bridging the inequality gap in their countries?
I think no country has been entirely successful in this respect. But as I was saying before, Thailand has made some significant improvements and should be proud of the fact that although inequality is high, it has moved in the right direction.
Would you give an A to Thailand?
No, not an A, but maybe a B.
A B. B, B plus or B minus? Or
Maybe B minus, but still better than most other countries. Another country, I mean, one country which I think has been quite innovative in inequality problems, it also has historically had a high inequality level, but that has improved, is Brazil. One thing that Brazil has used quite effectively is what is called conditional cash transfers. So Brazil has a lot of agriculture, and the farmers doing this agriculture tend to be not very wealthy, and furthermore, they create a cycle of poverty because not only are they poor, but they need their children to work on the farm. And so they don't want to send their children to school, and so their children end up being poor as well because they don't get the training they need from going to school. Now, the Brazilian government had a very clever program to fight this poverty trap, which was the conditional cash transfer, where families paid a certain amount of money on condition that they send their children to school. So this worked because the families were better off because of the cash, but more importantly, their children were going to school, and so in the next generation, those children were able to break free of the poverty that their parents lived in. So that kind of creative solution, I give Brazil a lot of credit for, and they've had other programs which have worked as well.
ปัญหาความเหลื่อมล้ำไม่ได้กระจุกตัวอยู่แค่ในประเทศเศรษฐกิจเกิดใหม่หรือประเทศยากจนเท่านั้นแต่ปัญหานี้ได้แผ่ขยายไปทุกที่ทั่วโลกไม่เว้นแต่ประเทศที่ร่ำรวยและทรงอำนาจอย่างสหรัฐอเมริกาและจีน
Is inequality more profound in developing countries if we compare that to developed countries?
Inequality due to globalization has been increasing everywhere. So it's not unique to developing countries at all. In fact, my own country, the US, which is a very rich country, has suffered, I would say, quite seriously from inequality in recent years. I would say that a lot of the political problems that we're facing now, the threat that Donald Trump poses, for example, can be traced to increasing inequality because it's that increasing inequality which makes the public dissatisfied with the political system. And politicians like Trump who promise easy solutions to a difficult problem have been able to take advantage of the discontent over inequality. So inequality is a problem everywhere.
Let's take the case of the US then. What went wrong? How come a rich country like the US can have the problem of inequality as well?
Well, I'm afraid that we forgot or we ignored that more globalization meant that only some people were going to be getting good new opportunities. There was a period from about 1990, a 20-year period from about 1990 to 2010, when the US was becoming more and more globalized, and it was growing as a result. That was a good thing, but the inequality at the same time was growing quickly too, and that's because globalization was spreading the benefits so unequally. It was just the people at the top ends who were benefiting from it, and many people, perhaps most people, were being left behind. In fact, a lot of jobs that used to be done in the US are now transplanted to Asia.
Outsourced.
They were outsourced because, and that was because of globalization. And what should have been done when the old jobs were being outsourced is people should have been provided with new skills to do the new tasks. And that was neglected. That was the big political mistake that was made. Somehow it was thought that this was going to happen automatically, but these things don't happen automatically. In fairness, it wasn't just globalization that was taking jobs away. It was also new technology, automation. Manufacturing, for example. Workers on assembly lines, we're seeing their jobs replaced by machines, which were doing what they used to do. In the long run, historical experience suggests that automation actually provides more jobs than before. And we know this from what happened in the 19th century. The early 19th century was the age of the first great industrial revolution, where we had many, many new technologies coming in. And the initial implication for the job market was to kill off a lot of jobs. A lot of people lost their jobs because of the new technology. But, and this is where capitalism comes in again, entrepreneurs figured out, eventually, it took some time, but they eventually figured out how to use the new technology and match that with human labor to do even better. In the end, the 19th century turned out to be the century of the most dramatic improvement in wages that the world has ever seen. It was because of a combination of new technology, but also entrepreneurial ability to match that new technology with human labor.
What about China? What's your perspective on China?
So China was perhaps the greatest success story of our time. Well, actually, I'd say 30 years, until about 2012 or so. Not only was China growing at a spectacular rate, over 10% a year in most years, but it was becoming a freer and freer country in a political sense. It was never a democracy, but it was becoming more and more possible for people to talk freely about almost anything. And then, unfortunately, that period of greater and greater liberation came to an end, and China has been moving in the opposite direction. Its government has become more and more repressive, and that has been bad, obviously, for political freedom, but it's also been bad economically, because a dynamic economy relies on the free exchange of ideas. That's where a country's dynamism comes from. It comes from ideas, but ideas have to be discussed and challenged and criticized in order to succeed. Sadly, the Chinese government has been interfering with that dynamism. And so I'm afraid that China may be in some some real trouble at this point as a result of its political mistakes.
ในโลกปัจจุบันที่ AI Artificial Intelligence หรือปัญญาประดิษฐ์พัฒนารุดหน้าไปอย่างรวดเร็วแน่นอนว่ามีหลายคนที่ได้ประโยชน์แต่เมื่อมีคนได้ก็ต้องมีคนเสียประโยชน์ด้วยเช่นกันการมาของ AI คุ้มค่าแค่ไหนคุ้มค่าพอไหมกับสิ่งที่มนุษย์จะต้องแลก
So you're positive about artificial intelligence that it would somehow create also a golden era like in the 19th century.
I'm a great believer in learning lessons from history. Someone once said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. In other words, we see similar things happening over and over again. And because we have always managed in the past to adapt so well, I'm pretty optimistic that we will be able to do it again. There's little doubt that the new technologies that are being developed now, like artificial intelligence, will in the long run create new jobs. The problem is that, again, this doesn't happen overnight. There is a lag, and in the meantime, a lot of old jobs are lost. And of course, the people who lose those jobs are unhappy. So the political process, politicians, government, have to take into account lags that adaptation to new technology entail.
Lastly, Professor, what would be your advice for each one of us as individual to stay ahead of the curve, to not be trapped in the inequality trap?
I think education is the key. Even middle class people who have been leading reasonably comfortable lives have to realize that the skills that they have been relying on may get out of date in an economy where technology is changing all the time, and technology could even eliminate their job.
Some people say 4 years of university education would be outdated by the time they receive the degrees. Do you agree with that?
Well, I'm not sure that having university education is even the essential part of the story. You learn many things at university which are actually unrelated to your ability to earn a good living. But one kind of institution which has worked very well in the US as a way of enabling people to update their skills is what we call community colleges. Community colleges are not really universities. They are places where you learn something very practical, like computer programming or how to be an electrician. Skills which are very much in demand, but require an investment of time and effort. In the US, community colleges are attended not just by young people of university age, but also by mature workers who want to acquire or update their skills so they keep ahead of the curve, as you were saying. That, I think, is the way for all of us to make sure that that technology doesn't get ahead of us.
Thank you so much, Professor Maskin,
You're
for your time
welcome.
today. Thank you.
ขอบคุณค่ะ เราเข้าสู่ยุคของ AI แล้วนะคะ ถ้าเป็นอย่างที่อาจารย์มาสกินได้บอกเปรียบเทียบให้ฟังว่าในอดีตเวลาที่มีการเปลี่ยนแปลงทางเทคโนโลยีหรือว่ามีนวัตกรรมใหม่ๆท้ายที่สุดแล้วเราก็จะได้ประโยชน์แต่ว่าเราเองจะต้องมีการปรับตัวให้เร็วเรียนรู้ให้ไวแล้วก็พัฒนาตัวเองอย่างสม่ำเสมอเพื่อที่จะรับมือแล้วก็ได้ประโยชน์จากการเปลี่ยนแปลงเหล่านั้นค่ะสวัสดีค่ะ